There's a great story of a distinguished art critic who was studying an exquisite painting, here it is, by the Italian Renaissance master Filippino Lippi. Robert Cumming, as many a critic had done before, stood gazing up at the 15th century depiction of Mary holding the infant Jesus on her lap, with two saints kneeling by. But like many had before, he was left troubled by the painting. It was clear that Lippi, as we can see, was an extremely gifted artist, highly skilled in the use of colour and composition. However, the proportions of the picture didn't seem right. The hills in the background seemed exaggerated. The two kneeling saints beside Mary looked awkward and uncomfortable. But at that moment, Robert Cumming had an epiphany. What if this painting was never intended for a pristine art gallery, hung at eye level, but instead to hang in a place of prayer? And so, this distinguished, dignified critic dropped to his knees and gazed up at the painting. Suddenly, he saw what generations of art critics before him had missed. From his knees, gazing up, the painting became perfectly proportioned. The foreground moved naturally to the background. The two saints seemed settled, their awkwardness, like the painting itself, having turned to grace. The eyes of Mary now fixed upon his, looking kindly as he knelt at her feet. It was not the perspective of the painting that had been wrong all these years. It was the perspective of the viewer. And here, Robert Cumming, on bended knee, found a beauty that Robert Cumming, the proud art critic, could not. On bended knee, the posture of humility and prayer, the painting came alive. Often our whole view of something can be radically transformed if we change our perspective. We immediately see something that we were seemingly blind to before. Having the right perspective and seeing things through spiritual eyes is at the heart of the passage we just heard from Mark chapter 8. See, Mark 8 sits at the center of his gospel, and it is the key turning point. Up until this point, Jesus' ministry has been marked by power and success, magnetism and enthusiastic crowds. But from now on, Jesus turns to walk the lonely path to suffering and the cross. Geographically, he is at the northernmost point of his ministry, but he's soon going to turn and head south. He will turn from the adulation of the crowds in Galilee and head south to the opposition of the authorities in Jerusalem. Leading up to this passage, you may know it, Jesus had just fed the 4,000, and then he'd rebuked the disciples because they did not understand the kingdom significance of what he had done. And then immediately after that, Jesus heals a blind man at Bethsaida. It's a healing, you might remember, that requires Jesus to twice put his hands on the man's eyes. The first time, his vision is partially restored. The second, it comes fully. The healing was to exemplify the blindness of the disciples and the surrounding crowds, a symbolic parallel to the need for Jesus to keep teaching them about the true nature of his ministry. It seems appropriate, therefore, that Jesus asks the disciples a question that he asks each one of those he calls to be his disciples. Who do you say I am? In other words, how do you see me? Am I just another prophet, like the people seem to suggest, or am I something more? Without a right understanding of who Jesus is, the disciples will not be able to follow the call of Jesus to deny themselves, to take up the cross of discipleship. And so too with us. Like the art critic's view of that famous painting, if we don't see Jesus as he really is, then we won't be able to fully grasp his calling on our lives. It is absolutely fundamental that we get our understanding of Jesus right, because it will ultimately shape whether we're willing to follow him, to give up everything for him. In our passage, Peter seems to get it 100% right at one moment and then 100% wrong the next. At one moment, he is seeing everything with the spiritual kingdom perspective. And then the next, he's back to seeing things through the lens of the world. And I think he acts for most of us. And thank goodness that the great apostle Peter can get it so amazingly right on one moment and then so horribly wrong in the next. Peter sees things, firstly, with that spiritual perspective. He glimpses the way of the kingdom and declares that this Jesus is the Messiah. He is the one, long awaited, in whom the hope of Israel rested, the one spoken about by the prophets, the chosen one, the one who was to redeem God's people, the one who was going to rescue and restore, to give sight to those who are spiritually blind. Jesus is still the Messiah. Is he a Messiah for you? The one to redeem you, to restore you, to break the chains in your life that are making you less of who you were made to be. Back to Peter, having got 100% on the Who is Jesus exam, Peter then goes back with his worldly eyes and tries to rebuke Jesus. Maybe Jesus, don't go ahead with this prediction of rejection and death and resurrection. Peter, no doubt, felt like this was his opportunity to get 100% on the how to advise Jesus exam. Hey, Jesus, it's me, Peter. I've got your back. I know that you're the Messiah. I've got that. That means you're the chosen one. But being the Messiah means defeating the Romans, right? Not suffering on a cross. Tom Wright says this: you might as well have had a football captain tell the team that he was intending to let the opposition score 10 goals right away. This wasn't what Peter and the rest had in mind. They certainly didn't think of him going straight to his death. I think Peter's experience probably describes the journey of faith and life that most of us can relate to. Life seems to be going great at one point, and then something tragic happens. You seem to have got it, and then suddenly everything seems a mystery. Jesus at one point feels very close. Your relationship to him so strong, and suddenly the next he is distant. And it's a theme that we see so often in the Bible. God's people take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's progress, but it's not easy. And so a word of encouragement. If you're feeling that you're taking a step back at the moment, if faith feels like a mystery, if you're going through a troubling and difficult time, know that you're not alone. Keep going. Keep pursuing Jesus. Keep taking those steps forward in faith. We all, no doubt, feel for Peter in this moment. Having got it so wrong, he's sternly rebuked by Jesus, and moreover, in front of the other disciples. That must have really hurt. And so Jesus goes on to explain the journey of the cross, that it was not just for him, but actually a calling for all those who want to be his disciples. And then he emphasizes these 2 perspectives on how to live. Either the spiritual kingdom perspective marked by self-denial, losing your life, taking up a cross of suffering and follow Jesus, or a worldly perspective, which even if you gained the whole world, would lose your very soul. In his book, Cost of Discipleship, theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, "When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die." Back in chapter 1 of Mark's Gospel, Jesus had called those first disciples to pick up their cross and follow him. He called Simon and Andrew to leave their nets, their one source of income and financial security, James and John, we're told, left their father Zebedee in the boat to follow Jesus. Now, in first century Jewish culture, it would have seemed scandalous, a scandalous failure of a son's duty. And so here in chapter 8, the disciples would have already, in part, recognized the cost of following Jesus. But now Jesus is emphasizing that whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. The language would have been shocking to Jesus' hearers, as it should be still to us today. But often it can lose its edge, often interpreted into more comfortable terms of maybe discipleship that requires us to carry an, at the most, inconvenient burden through life, or some kind of sacrifice every so often. But this cannot possibly be what Jesus means. Christian language of self-denial and even cross-bearing has possibly dulled the force of Jesus' words. Jesus' words are not to be taken as merely metaphorical. They were about literal death, following the condemned man on his way to execution. The challenge is extraordinary, daunting, impossible even. If you were told that following Jesus would likely lead to your death, would you take up the call? And in the end, Jesus does go to the cross alone. Not one of his disciples follows him to death. Peter, the great apostle, instead of dying with Jesus, denies him 3 times and abandons him at his darkest moments. But of course, the cross is not the end. As I quoted last week, Bishop Leslie Newbigin says that the resurrection was not the reversal of a defeat, but the manifestation of a victory. The cross and resurrection are the greatest victories to be taken place in the history of the world. And it was this victory and the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost that changed everything for Peter and the rest of the disciples. It was through the experience of the resurrection and the coming of the Holy Spirit that enabled each disciple to go on and carry their cross, nearly all of them to martyrdom. The resurrection changes everything. And through it, these disciples' whole perspective was transformed. They had seen glimpses in the life and teaching of Jesus, but through the power of the Holy Spirit, it's like the light bulb was switched on. Their perspective was changed, and they could see everything through the lens of the kingdom. As with the disciples, so too with us. That's why I pray and I long for more of God's Spirit in my life and in the life of this church, to see the effects of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit in tangible ways amongst us. And that's why I keep on praying for this church. Come, Holy Spirit, come. At the heart of the surrounding culture that we live in is a narrative that everyone should be free to find out who they are, and then the place to find that out is from within. That if only I can search deep enough within myself, I will find my true identity. That's what our culture is telling us. The gospel, the way of the kingdom, says this: if you want to find out who you are truly meant to be, don't look to yourself. Look to him. Look to Jesus. And so the Message translation of Jesus' final sentences in Mark 8 says this: self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, to saving yourself, your true self. As Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5, and he, that's Jesus, died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. We're called to live for Jesus, to point our lives towards him. And that's where we will find our true identity. Mark's gospel is at pains to express that the life of Jesus was marked by pain, rejection, suffering, and death, but also glorious resurrection, salvation, and restoration. So too with the life of a disciple. We're called to take up our cross and follow, but we do so in the power of the Holy Spirit and with the hope of the resurrection. And that hope makes the seemingly impossible possible. It's through the power of the Holy Spirit and the lens of the resurrection that we're given a kingdom perspective. And like the painting by the famous artist Lippi, it's only on our knees, that position of surrender, of humility, of prayer and worship, that we can see things with a heavenly perspective and see what God is doing. So maybe today is a moment, another moment, and it's certainly the case in my life, to recommit yourself to the call to take up your cross and follow Jesus, and to ask for more of the Spirit to enable you to do that.